Nathaniel Wakefield stood at the window of his penthouse 40 floors above Chicago, watching the first snow of November fall over a city that knew his name but had never once asked how he was doing. Behind him, a woman in a red dress was already reaching for the velvet box on the table, her fingers trembling with an excitement that had nothing to do with him. She had not asked about his flight, his father's failing health, or the merger that had kept him awake for 3 straight nights. She had only asked if the bracelet inside the box was for her. He watched her clasp it around her wrist and hold it up to the light, turning her hand this way and that, and something inside him went as quiet and cold as the snow gathering on the glass. He thought of every woman before her, every dinner where his net worth had done the talking, every smile that had flickered the instant his assistant mentioned a number. He was 34 years old, worth more than most countries, and he could not remember the last time someone had wanted nothing from him at all. She left an hour later with the bracelet and a kiss on his cheek that felt like it belonged to a stranger, and Nathaniel stood alone in a room full of things he had bought and none of the things he actually wanted. He thought about his father, 5 years gone now, who had built the company from a single hangar and a second-hand plane, and who used to say that a man only really learns who loves him once he has nothing left to give. Nathaniel had spent a decade avoiding that lesson, and tonight, watching the snow fall, he decided he was finally ready to learn it the hard way. If this video has kept you warm so far, tap that subscribe button and hit like before the story pulls you further in, because Winter Veil has a lot more waiting for you tonight. There is something about the first snowfall that always makes me think about the people we let get close to us, and how rarely we stop to ask why they stayed. I wrote this one thinking about a man who had everything except the one thing money could never buy, and I hope his story finds you the way it found me. 2 days later, Nathaniel walked into the office of Marcus Riley, the only person on his payroll who had known him since business school and had never once asked for anything but a paycheck. He told Marcus he was disappearing for a while. No phone, no driver, no name that anyone would recognize. Marcus argued for exactly 4 minutes before he saw the look on his boss's face and stopped, because he understood that some men had to lose everything on purpose just to find out what was real. Marcus made him promise one thing before he left, that if anything ever went truly wrong, he would find a way to send word, even a single line through an old email account nobody else knew about. Nathaniel agreed, mostly to ease his old friend's worry, and the next morning, he emptied his wallet of every card that carried his name, left his phone charging on the kitchen counter, and walked out of the building through the service entrance like a man shedding an old coat. By the following week, Nathaniel Wakefield had vanished from every headline that had ever chased him, and a stranger in a worn canvas jacket was walking the shoulder of a two-lane highway in Vermont with nothing but a duffel bag and $11 in his pocket. The wind cut sideways across the open fields, and the sky had the flat gray color that meant more snow was coming before nightfall. He had told himself this would feel like freedom, and for the first mile, it almost did. By the third mile, his legs had gone numb and his stomach was folding in on itself, and the freedom he had imagined felt a lot more like fear. He had not eaten a real meal in 2 days, not because he could not afford one, but because he had left every card and every dollar of real money locked in a safe back in Chicago, keeping only enough small bills to survive without ever being tempted to prove who he was. A truck rumbled past without slowing, spraying slush across his jeans, and he laughed out loud at the absurdity of a billionaire nearly weeping over a splash of dirty snow. He passed a gas station near a crossroads where a young father was counting coins for gas and coming up short, and without thinking twice, Nathaniel pressed the last few dollars he could spare into the man's palm and kept walking before he could be thanked. It was the first time in years he had given something away without a camera nearby or a tax deduction attached to it, and the strange lightness that followed him down the road afterward surprised him more than the hunger did. The town he stumbled into just before dark was called Maple Hollow, a cluster of brick storefronts and porch lights strung along a single main street, the kind of place that still had a general store with a bell over the door instead of a chain pharmacy on every corner. Snow had started falling again, fat, unhurried flakes that softened every rooftop and street lamp. And for a moment, Nathaniel forgot how hungry he was and simply stood there watching the town glow gold against the coming dark. Then his knees buckled, and the sidewalk came up to meet him faster than he expected. Clara Ellsworth was locking the front door of her father's store when she heard the sound, a dull thud against the pavement that made her spin around before she had even finished turning the key. She saw a man collapsed near the curb, his dark hair dusted with snow, his jacket far too thin for a Vermont winter, and she did not stop to think before she was on her knees beside him, pressing 2 fingers to his throat to find a pulse. He was breathing, but his lips had a bluish tint that frightened her more than she wanted to admit. She got an arm under his shoulders, surprised by how heavy he was for someone so obviously starved, and half dragged, half walked him through the door of the store and into the warmth behind the counter. His eyes opened halfway, unfocused, and he mumbled something about not needing help before his head dropped against her shoulder again. Clara had grown up in this town watching her father turn away no one who knocked on their door in a storm, and she was not about to be the one who let a stranger freeze 2 feet from their porch. Her father, Walter Ellsworth, came down from the apartment above the store, still wiping flour from his hands, took one look at the situation, and did not ask a single question before helping his daughter carry the stranger to the small guest room off the kitchen. They laid him on the bed, peeled off his soaked boots, and covered him with every blanket in the hall closet, while Clara heated broth on the stove with hands that would not quite stop shaking. Walter watched his daughter work and said quietly that whoever this man was, life had walked him straight to their door for a reason. Nathaniel woke 12 hours later to the smell of cinnamon and the sound of a woman humming somewhere beyond the door, and for a long, confused moment, he could not remember why his body ached in every direction. Then it came back to him in pieces: the highway, the cold, the sidewalk rushing up, and he sat bolt upright to find a room he did not recognize and a stack of folded clothes at the foot of the bed that were clearly not his own. When Clara pushed the door open a minute later with a bowl of broth balanced in both hands, he found himself staring at a face he would spend the rest of his life trying to describe and never quite managing. She had auburn hair pulled back in a loose braid, eyes the warm brown of strong coffee, and a smile that reached her eyes before it ever touched her mouth, the kind of beauty that did not seem to know it was beautiful at all. She introduced herself simply as Clara, set the bowl on the nightstand, and told him he had scared her half to death collapsing outside her father's shop. He opened his mouth to explain who he really was, some easy lie already forming about a wallet that had been stolen, and instead heard himself say only that his name was Nate and that he did not have anywhere else to go. Clara did not ask the questions most people would have asked, not about family or a job or why a grown man was wandering the highway with almost nothing to his name. She simply told him he could stay in the guest room until he was back on his feet, that her father could always use an extra set of hands around the store, and that in Maple Hollow nobody went hungry if she had anything to say about it. Nathaniel sat there with the broth cooling in his hands and felt something crack open in his chest that had been sealed shut for as long as he could remember. Later that same night, unable to sleep, he heard Clara talking quietly to her father downstairs, and he crept close enough to catch fragments of the conversation. That her mother had passed 8 years earlier from an illness that had drained every dollar the family had saved, and that Clara had given up a scholarship to study engineering so she could stay and keep the store running. Nathaniel lay back down feeling something close to shame, because he had spent the last decade complaining about the burden of more money than he could spend, while the woman who had saved his life had walked away from her entire future to keep her family standing. Over the next several days, snow kept falling in soft, steady waves that blanketed the fields behind the store, and Nate began to learn the rhythm of a life he had never once experienced from the inside. He swept floors, hauled crates of apples and root vegetables from the cellar, and fixed a squeaking hinge on the storeroom door with tools that felt foreign and wonderful in his hands. Walter taught him how to restock shelves without breaking his back and told him stories about Clara's mother in a voice that still cracked with love every time he said her name. Clara watched the stranger closely those first weeks, the way he flinched at loud noises like a man used to silence, the way his hands were too soft for someone claiming to have worked labor jobs his whole life, and the way he sometimes stared at prices on the shelf as if the numbers physically hurt him. She never pushed, because something told her that whatever he was running from, he would tell her when he was ready, and pushing would only make him run again. Instead, she simply kept setting an extra plate at dinner every night without being asked, and watched the haunted look in his eyes soften a little more each week. One afternoon, a young mother named Denise came into the store counting change for formula and diapers, her toddler fussing on her hip, and came up $11 short at the register. Before Clara could even reach for the till to cover the difference herself, Nate had already quietly slid the missing bills across the counter from his own thin wages, waving off Denise's embarrassed thanks and telling her only that everyone needed a little help sometimes. Clara said nothing in the moment, but she found herself thinking about that $11 for days afterward, the exact amount he had once walked into town with himself. The town began preparing for its annual Christmas market the first week of December, and every storefront on Main Street strung fresh lights along its windows, while the town square filled with wooden stalls selling mulled cider and hand-knit mittens. Nate spent 2 full evenings on a ladder outside the Ellsworth store hanging strands of lights at Walter's direction, and Clara stood below calling out corrections until he finally threatened to drop the whole tangled mess directly on her head. It was, without either of them saying it out loud, the closest thing to a real family holiday Nate could remember having in years. One Sunday when the store was closed, Clara talked him into walking down to the frozen pond behind the schoolhouse, insisting that nobody could survive a Vermont winter without learning to skate at least once. Nate lasted less than a minute upright before his feet went out from under him, and Clara laughed so hard she had to sit down in the snow beside him, both of them soaked and freezing and unable to stop grinning at each other. He would later tell her, only half joking, that falling on his back in front of her had been more fun than any vacation his money had ever bought him. One evening in early December, while Clara was closing out the register and Nate was stacking the last crate of the day, a man in an expensive charcoal coat walked into the store, and Nate felt every muscle in his back go rigid before he even turned around. Preston Dunmore owned half the commercial property on Main Street and had been trying to buy the Ellsworth building for 2 years running, always with a smile too wide and a handshake that lingered a beat too long. He set a small wrapped box on the counter and told Clara it was early, but he had seen it and thought of her. Clara pushed the box gently back across the counter and told him, not unkindly, that she had already given him her answer the last 3 times he asked. Preston's smile thinned at the edges as he glanced past her at Nate, taking in the flannel shirt and the calloused hands with open contempt, and asked Clara loud enough for the whole store to hear whether she had really traded a future with him for a stray she had picked up off the sidewalk. Nate said nothing, only set the crate down slowly, but the look in his eyes made Preston Dunmore step back toward the door before he finished buttoning his coat. After Preston left, Clara apologized for the scene, but Nate told her she had nothing to apologize for, that watching her stand her ground had been the most honest thing he had seen in longer than she could imagine. She asked him, half joking, what could possibly be more honest than a man in a coat that expensive, and Nate almost told her everything right then, the penthouse, the company, the name that would have made half the state recognize him instantly. Instead, he swallowed the confession and told her only that money had a way of making people forget how to be kind, and that he was trying very hard to remember. Weeks folded into a month, and something between them shifted from careful distance into an ease that neither of them commented on out loud. They played checkers by the wood stove after closing, Clara winning most nights and accusing him of losing on purpose just to keep her talking, and Nate laughing in a way that felt unfamiliar in his own chest, like a muscle he had forgotten how to use. He found himself memorizing the small things, the way she hummed while restocking shelves, the way her nose wrinkled when she laughed too hard, the way she always gave the last apple to whichever customer looked like they needed it most. One frostbright morning, Nate walked with Clara to deliver a crate of preserves to old Agnes Caro, who lived alone at the edge of town in a house with a porch that badly needed repair. Agnes had known Clara since she was born and did not bother hiding her opinion, telling Nate flatly over a cup of chicory coffee that she had watched a lot of men pass through this town, and none of them had ever looked at Clara Ellsworth the way he did. Nate did not deny it, only smiled into his cup and asked if Agnes needed that porch step fixed before the next storm rolled through. He spent the rest of that afternoon on his knees in the cold, replacing rotted boards with lumber he had paid for out of the small wages Walter insisted on giving him, and Agnes watched from her window with a knowing look that she carried back to Clara later that week over pie. Clara found herself thinking about that afternoon more than she wanted to admit. The sight of Nate working in the snow without complaint, asking nothing in return, simply because an old woman he barely knew needed help. She realized, somewhere between the porch step and the second slice of pie, that she was falling for a man whose last name she did not even know. By the middle of December, snow had settled thick and permanent across Maple Hollow, turning the fields behind the store into a single unbroken sheet of white that caught the porch light every evening like scattered glass. Nate had started teaching Clara chess on quiet afternoons when the store was empty, and one particular evening, after she had cornered his king in a move he swore she had cheated to find, she asked him outright if he was ever going to tell her where he had really come from. He set his king on its side in surrender and admitted, quietly, that he had lost a great deal before he ever found this town, more than she could probably guess, and that some days it still felt easier to be nobody than to explain who he used to be. Clara reached across the checkerboard and covered his hand with hers and told him that whoever he used to be, she liked who he was now, snow and all. That night, walking her home from the store under a sky heavy with the promise of another storm, Nate stopped in the middle of the street and told her, plainly, that he thought he was falling in love with her. Clara's breath caught visibly in the cold air, and she admitted, just as plainly, that she had been falling for weeks and had simply been too afraid to say it first. He wanted, more than anything, to tell her the truth right then, standing under the streetlight with snow catching in her hair like scattered stars. But the fear of watching her face change stopped the words in his throat one more time. He told himself he would say it tomorrow, and then the next day, and each morning the lie grew a little heavier in his chest, even as the life around it grew warmer than anything he had ever known. He did not yet understand that a debt like that always comes due eventually, and rarely on your own terms. The Christmas market opened that weekend under a sky finally clear of clouds, and the whole town turned out bundled in scarves and heavy coats, children chasing each other between the stalls while carolers gathered near the town's single evergreen strung with lights. Nate helped Walter run the store's stand selling preserves and fresh bread, and more than once he caught Clara watching him from across the square with an expression he could not quite name, something between happiness and a question she had not yet asked out loud. For one perfect evening, standing in the cold with cider warming his hands and Clara's shoulder pressed against his, Nate let himself forget entirely that he was still living under a name that was not his own. Meanwhile, in Chicago, Marcus Riley had spent 3 weeks quietly tracking his employer's trail, following a hunch through gas station receipts and a single grainy photo from a hospital's parking lot camera near the Vermont border. When he finally located Maple Hollow and drove up unannounced in a car far too polished for the town's narrow streets, he made the mistake of asking the wrong person for directions to the address he had traced. Preston Dunmore happened to be standing outside the bank at that exact moment, and his ears sharpened the instant he heard the stranger mention the name Wakefield. It took Preston less than 2 days to piece together what Marcus had let slip, a name searched online, a face matched to a business magazine cover, and suddenly the drifter sweeping floors at the Ellsworth store had a net worth with more zeros than the entire town's property value combined. Preston sat with that information for a full night, turning it over like a weapon he had been handed by pure luck, and by morning he had decided exactly how he intended to use it. He did not go to Clara first. He went to the diner on Main Street, where half the town ate breakfast, and made sure his voice carried. By noon, whispers were moving through Maple Hollow faster than the snow could fall, and by the time Clara heard the rumors secondhand from a customer at the register, her hands had already gone cold with dread before she even understood why. She found Nate in the storeroom, stacking cans with his back to her, and asked him straight out, her voice shaking, whether it was true that his real name was Nathaniel Wakefield and that he was worth billions of dollars. He turned around slowly, and the guilt written plainly across his face answered the question before he ever opened his mouth. He tried to explain, the words tumbling out too fast, that he had never meant to deceive her, that he had come here broken and searching for something real, that every day he had spent with her had been the most honest thing in his entire life, even if his name had been a lie. Clara backed toward the door, her eyes bright with tears she refused to let fall in front of him, and told him that honesty built on a lie was still a lie, no matter how good the reasons behind it sounded. She walked out into the falling snow and did not look back, and Nate stood alone among the shelves he had stocked with his own 2 hands. Feeling colder than he had the night he collapsed on that sidewalk. Walter found Nate sitting on the porch steps an hour later, snow gathering untouched on his shoulders, and instead of the anger Nate expected, the older man simply sat down beside him and asked quietly whether he had lied about anything else: the wages he asked for, the work he had done, the way he had treated Clara every single day. Nate said no, none of that had been a lie, only his name and the fortune attached to it. And Walter nodded slowly and told him that trust, once cracked, did not heal with an apology alone. It healed with time and with actions loud enough to drown out the lie that broke it in the first place. For the next several days, Clara refused to speak to him beyond the barest necessities of running the store together, her voice polite and distant in a way that hurt worse than shouting ever could have. Nate kept working anyway, kept fixing what needed fixing and hauling what needed hauling, because leaving felt like proving Preston right, that a man like him could never actually belong in a place like this. Late one night, unable to sleep, he quietly arranged through Marcus to pay off the store's overdue property tax bill without telling a soul, then sat awake wondering if kindness meant anything at all when it had to be done in secret to avoid looking like a bribe. Preston, sensing that Clara's anger had not yet turned to permanent rejection, doubled down on his campaign, showing up at the store daily with new gifts and reminders that he could offer her a life without struggle, without secrets, without a man who had lied to her for over a month. Clara turned him away every single time, her refusals sharper now, edged with an exhaustion that had nothing to do with him and everything to do with the ache she still felt every time she looked at Nate across the store. Preston left each time more furious than before, and furious men in small towns rarely stay quiet for long. He began making calls of his own that week, first to a contractor he had used before for less honest jobs, then to a man 2 towns over who owed him a favor and asked few questions about what the favor involved. Preston told himself he only wanted to scare the Ellsworths into finally selling. Nothing more. A small fire in the old barn to remind Walter how much easier life could be with Preston's money behind him instead of some stranger's charity. He did not think, or chose not to think, about what could happen if the fire did not stay small. 10 days after the truth came out, in the coldest week of the whole winter so far, a fire broke out in the wooden barn behind the Ellsworth property where Walter stored feed and firewood for half the town's animals. Clara screamed for her father the moment she smelled smoke through her bedroom window, and by the time they reached the yard, flames were already licking up the old timber walls faster than either of them could process. Neighbors came running with buckets and a garden hose that did almost nothing against a fire that size, and somewhere in the chaos, someone shouted that Walter had gone back inside for the animals and had not come back out. Nate did not hesitate for even a second, sprinting toward the burning barn while 3 men grabbed for his arms and Clara screamed his name into the smoke-thick air, begging him not to go in. He shoved past them, wrapped his jacket over his mouth, and disappeared through the doorway into a wall of heat and black smoke. And for the longest 10 seconds of Clara's life, nothing came out of that barn except fire and noise. Then the doors burst open again, and Nate stumbled out with Walter's arms slung over his shoulders, both of them coughing violently. Soot streaked across faces that were somehow, impossibly, still breathing. Clara reached them before the volunteer fire crew even had their hoses uncoiled, dropping to her knees in the snow beside her father and Nate, checking every inch of both of them with hands that would not stop trembling. Walter waved off the fuss between coughs, insisting he was fine, but Clara turned to Nate, soot-streaked and bleeding from a shallow cut along his forearm, and for the first time in 10 days looked at him the way she had before any of this had happened. Maybe, she admitted quietly to herself as the fire crew finally arrived, she had been wrong to let one lie erase everything true that had come before it. The fire marshal's investigation began the following morning, and it did not take long for the local sheriff to notice tire tracks near the barn's rear access road that matched no vehicle belonging to anyone on the Ellsworth property. Security footage from a neighbor's driveway camera, grainy but usable, showed a truck idling near the tree line an hour before the fire started, and further digging traced the vehicle registration straight back to a company Preston Dunmore quietly controlled through a shell corporation. 2 days later, the sheriff walked into Dunmore Realty with a warrant in hand and 2 deputies at his back, right in the middle of the busiest hour on Main Street. Preston tried to bluster his way through it, insisting there had to be a mistake, that a man in his position did not set fires in his own town. But the hired contractor had already cracked under questioning that morning and named him directly in exchange for a lighter sentence. The sheriff read him his rights right there on the sidewalk in front of the bank, and when Preston caught sight of Nate standing across the street with his arm around Clara, he shouted that none of this would have happened if some stranger had not come waltzing into town pretending to be something he wasn't. Nate said nothing back, only watched in silence as the deputies guided Preston into the back of the cruiser, understanding better than anyone in that crowd exactly how much damage a well-kept lie could do once it finally came apart. Half of Maple Hollow watched through the storefront windows as Preston Dunmore was led out of his own office in handcuffs, his expensive coat suddenly looking a great deal smaller than it had a week earlier. Clara stood across the street with her father, watching in silence, feeling no satisfaction in it at all, only a tired sort of relief that it was finally over. News of the arrest spread through Maple Hollow even faster than the original rumor about Nate's fortune had, and this time the whispers carried something closer to shame than gossip, because half the town realized they had judged the wrong man from the very beginning. Clara found Nate sitting alone on the porch steps that evening, staring out at the scorched remains of the barn under a sky just beginning to spit fresh snow, and she sat down beside him without a word, close enough that their shoulders touched. He told her softly that he understood if she still could not trust him, that he would keep working here as long as she allowed it, asking for nothing more than the chance to prove himself one snowfall at a time. Clara turned to look at him then, snow catching gently in her braid the same way it had the night he first told her he loved her, and admitted that she had spent every one of those 10 angry days missing him more than she had ever missed anyone in her life. She said that watching him run into that fire without a second of hesitation had told her everything his real name never could, that money had not made him who he was, and that the man who fixed Agnes Caro porch step for nothing had never once been a lie. Even now, some small frightened part of her still hesitated, worried that the moment she let herself fully trust him again, the ground might shift once more beneath her feet, and she told him so honestly instead of pretending the fear was already gone. Nate reached for her hand and told her he understood that fear better than anyone, because he had spent 10 years surrounded by people and had still felt entirely alone, and he was not asking her to forget what had happened, only to let him spend the rest of his life earning back every ounce of trust he had spent so carelessly. Something in her finally loosened at that, the last cold knot behind her ribs melting the way the snowbanks would melt come spring, and she leaned into him under the falling snow like something in her had finally been allowed to rest. The next morning, still unsure whether her heart had healed as fast as it felt, Clara walked down to Agnes Caro house and sat at her kitchen table, turning a cup of chicory coffee in slow circles without drinking it. Agnes listened to the whole story without interrupting, then told Clara plainly that trusting a man again after he had lied to you took more courage than never trusting him in the first place, and that courage, in her long experience, was usually worth it when the man in question had run into a burning building for people who were not even his own family. Clara left that kitchen with her mind steadier than it had been in 10 days, and by the time she reached the store, she already knew exactly what she wanted to say to Nate. He told her everything that night, sitting by the wood stove with Walter dozing nearby, the company his father had built and left to him too young, the years of women who wanted his name more than they ever wanted him, the exhaustion that had driven him out onto that highway with nothing but $11 and a desperate hope of being seen as simply a man. Clara listened without interrupting, and when he finished, she told him that the version of him she had fallen for was sitting right there in front of her, broke or billionaire, and that nothing about the money changed a single thing she felt. Marcus Riley drove up from Chicago the week after the arrest, not to manage a scandal this time, but simply to see for himself the town that had apparently talked his old friend into staying forever. He found Nate on a ladder repainting the store's front sign, sleeves rolled up despite the cold, and stood there for a long moment, just watching before he finally said that in 15 years he had never once seen Nathaniel Wakefield look this unguarded in a photograph, let alone in person. Nate climbed down, shook his hand, and told him that for the first time since his father died, he finally understood what all that money had actually been for. Spring came late to Maple Hollow that year, but when the thaw finally arrived, Nate used a fraction of his fortune to rebuild the barn twice as sturdy as before, quietly funded the town's volunteer fire department with new equipment, and paid off Preston Dunmore's outstanding claims against half the shopkeepers on Main Street so nobody else in town would ever be pressured to sell out of desperation. Walter protested every single gesture until Nate finally told him, half laughing, that a man had to spend his money on something, and he could not think of anywhere better than the town that had saved his life. Denise, the young mother from the store, showed up one afternoon with a pan of cornbread and tears in her eyes, telling Clara that Nate had quietly covered 3 months of her rent through an anonymous fund at the bank, and that she had only found out because the bank clerk let it slip by accident. Clara said nothing to Nate about it that evening, only kissed him on the cheek while he was sweeping the front steps and told him she loved him. And when he asked what had brought that on, she only smiled and said a woman was allowed to have her reasons. On the first truly warm afternoon of April, with the last patches of snow melting along the tree line behind the store, Nate walked Clara out to the spot where he had collapsed on the sidewalk 5 months earlier, now cleared of ice and lined with the season's first crocuses pushing up through the mud. He knelt right there on that same stretch of pavement, pulled a small box from his jacket, and told her that this was the exact place his whole life had actually started, the moment a stranger with cold hands and a warmer heart had decided to save someone who had nothing left to offer her but the truth. Clara said yes before he even finished the question, laughing through tears as half of Main Street gathered on porches to watch. Because in a town this small, nothing stayed a secret for long, not even a proposal. They married that June in the field behind the Ellsworth store, Walter walking his daughter down a grass aisle lined with mason jars of wildflowers, Agnes Caro crying openly in the front row, and Marcus Riley standing quietly in the back, grinning like a man who had always known exactly how this story would end. Denise stood near the front with her toddler on her hip, and when Clara passed her on the way to the altar, she squeezed Denise's hand and whispered a quiet thank you for reminding her, all those months ago, why she had fallen for a stranger with $11 and an honest heart in the first place. Walter gave a short toast at the reception that ended with half the guests in tears, saying only that he had prayed for years that someone would come along who loved his daughter for exactly who she was, and that life had sent him a billionaire who swept floors instead, which he supposed was proof that some prayers arrived wearing very strange disguises. A year later, Nathaniel and Clara Wakefield opened a small foundation out of the very general store where they had met, funding winter relief programs for families across 3 counties who found themselves facing exactly the kind of cold, hungry desperation that had once driven a broken billionaire to collapse on a Vermont sidewalk. Clara ran the daily operations herself, refusing every suggestion that she hire someone else to handle the people who came through their doors, because she still believed the most important part of helping anyone was simply looking them in the eye. Nate, for his part, still swept the store floors most mornings before the foundation opened, telling anyone who asked that some habits from the best year of his life were never meant to be broken. Denise's daughter, old enough now to help stack shelves after school, liked to ask Clara how her parents had really met, certain the version involving a collapsed stranger and $11 had to be exaggerated for effect. Clara always told her it was every word true, and that the real lesson was never about the money at all, but about the $11 he gave away before anyone even knew his name. Walter, listening from behind the register as he always did, would simply smile and go back to restocking the shelf closest to the door, the same shelf he had once helped carry a stranger past on the worst night of a long, cold winter. On quiet winter evenings, long after the store had closed and the foundation's lights had gone dark for the night, Clara would sometimes find her husband standing at the window watching the snow fall the way he had the night this whole story began. Except now his face held nothing but peace instead of that cold, hollow exhaustion she had first mistaken for a stranger's grief. She would slide her arms around him from behind and ask what he was thinking, and he would tell her, every single time, that he was simply grateful the snow had led him somewhere real. Nate kept one thing from his old life after all, a single framed photograph on the store's back office wall, not of a boardroom or a headline, but of a snowy sidewalk in Maple Hollow with a small brass plaque underneath that read simply, "The place a stranger became a husband." Visitors sometimes asked about it, expecting a business story, and Clara always answered the same way, that it was proof true love rarely arrives dressed the way you expect, and that the best things in life, like the first snow of winter, tend to fall quietly and change everything anyway. If this story warmed you tonight, make sure you are subscribed to Winter Veil, because there is always another one waiting just past the next storm.